Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our week 4 critique. I just want to do a quick mic check and make sure you guys can hear me okay. So just say hello in the chat box if you're here and you can hear just fine. Before we get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about what's coming up for the next 2 weeks, the final 2 weeks of the class, and what your final project will be. So I don't know if any of you have looked already. I had released the photo reference. And so in this next week, we're going to kind of push our understanding and concept of color outside the normal realm of what we would consider flesh tones. And we talk a little bit about theatrical lighting and mood lighting to create, some more interesting effects in painting. So that's what we're going to be doing. So the next project is going to be a 2-week painting. So you guys are just going to do one painting over the next 2 weeks. And you can either choose to do one of your own photos, or you can use one of the ones I provide. If you are going to use one of your own, try to send me the photo reference by Monday. That way you have enough time to get started. I want to make sure everyone's working from the best possible photograph. So go ahead and send that in by email to me, and I will let you know if it'll work for what we'll be doing. It doesn't have to use the color gels if you don't want it to. That's entirely up to you. You can also choose to revisit one of the previous paintings from the past few weeks if you want. But I do encourage you guys to kind of take on the challenge of this week's painting, even if you just do like a little smaller color study, because it's really going to kind of push you probably out of your comfort zone even more with understanding color and how we use it in painting to tell a story. Also our understanding of how flesh tones work. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say about the next project. So next week, one thing to keep in mind is I don't want you guys to rush through your project. So focus on getting a good drawing, a good structured kind of first underpainting. So if you don't have enough time to do the whole portrait, concentrate on the face, maybe establish a little bit of the background for next week's critique, because you'll have a whole other week after that to kind of finish things up and make corrections and that sort of thing. So at least focus on the portrait itself for next week. And I provided photo references of fair, medium, and dark models, all under the different kinds of color gel lights. So feel free to use any of those. You don't have to do the same one I'm doing, of course. So that was pretty much it. Does anyone have any questions about that? Alrighty. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So we're going to start with you, Karina. If you are in here, just say hello and let me know if you need any adjustments. Now, I went through all of our photographs last night and tried to adjust some of the color and the exposure if it seemed a little bit off. And so I already kind of edited some of these down a little bit, but if it really looks off to you, just let me know and I can play with it a little bit. Okay, so this everyone did really well too. I know that if you're not used to painting darker skin tones, I know some in my first morning session said this was the first time they'd ever painted someone with darker skin. It has its own set of challenges. I'm sure each one has had its challenges for you guys, but I think everyone did an excellent job. Nobody's really turned in anything that didn't feel like a dark skin model, so that you guys did really well. And just one thing to remember is that it's all about controlling your values. And value is always more important than color in the sense of, capturing not only form to make something look realistic and dimensional, but also to capture, the inherent average skin tone of your model. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into this one. I think overall the skin tones are pretty well captured. I think the shadow could be just a tiny bit darker, namely that reflected light. On her, it's just slightly lighter than what we get in the core shadow. So if I take kind of a sample of that here, you can see it's quite dark, and here it's quite light. Now that also depends on if you worked from the photo but lightened it up a little bit, or maybe it looked a little brighter on your monitor or your print. There can be some variation there. But one thing that will help her feel a little bit darker is being able to push those values a little bit darker in the shadow, so that way when you get into these midtones, they're on the darker side as well. So like her midtone right adjacent to that shadow is around there, and you have kind of two here. There's one that's kind of a darker green and one that seems to be a lighter green. I would say you'd want to favor maybe the darker green, but maybe it could be a little bit less green overall. So I'll just put that one next to it. Let's see, so the next color seems pretty close. So I'm going to do the mid-tone transition in that cheek. You're just a little bit on the light side, and that's okay. These are things to always consider, and I noticed some people who had turned in homework on the forum who are not part of the critique group had a similar situation where their average flesh tone was actually pretty good, but their transitions to the shadow, those midtones or those dark midtones, were not quite dark enough, so it made the person feel a little bit more pale than they actually were. And that's kind of what's happening here, because when I look at other areas where you have like the average skin tone, it feels pretty accurate to what she has. If I even go up in here, that seems pretty good. So if I take, other than the color maybe being a little bit on the warm side, I do feel like your value works well. So let me label a couple of these here for you before I forget. So this is your shadow here, and you want to go a little bit darker. So you would say take this color and then add ultramarine blue and probably another transparent brown like the trans red oxide. And that's going to give you something a little bit deeper to work with. So your transition tones are a little bit on the green side. I think if you just took those and then you added a little bit of even a cad red might be too bright. Maybe a burnt sienna. You can try cad red. It's just going to lighten the value a little bit, and we want to make sure we keep it on the darker end of the spectrum. So this is your shadow. This is the dark mid transition. This one was the cheek on right. So yours was a little bit on the brighter side. And so for that one, I would just take and add a little bit of ultramarine blue. That's going to cool it off a little bit, and it will also make it a little bit darker. And then, oh, I flipped these. This was your average flesh. She's just a little bit more pink, and I realize that it depends on the area that we're kind of looking on her skin tones. She does have those yellow undertones, but she also has some kind of cool pinks in other areas. So I think if you just pull back the yellow in some select areas, it will kind of balance out. So just a little bit of maybe ultramarine blue, which will cool that color off, and maybe some alizarin, and that will give you this color here, which would be a little closer to her average flesh tone. The only other color that I would like to address is the highlight color. Hers in your painting is a little bit on the yellow side, whereas in here she has more of like a cool pink, and that's going to provide some nice contrast to, so to go from there to there, maybe this is more of like an alizarin and white mixture. It's going to provide a little more contrast to all those warm yellowish undertones, because if you think about it, this is kind of a pink violet, so that's going to complement some of those warmer flesh tones that we have, those yellower flesh tones. So really nice job. I think you captured her likeness really nicely, and overall it does feel like her, but I think some areas can get a little bit darker. So let's do a quick paint over here. And I'll just show you what it would look like to push some of those shadows a little bit darker. And you could even do this with like a glaze if you wanted to go back in later. You don't have to apply it opaque. When you're just trying to darken something like a shadow edge, you can just apply a transparent glaze. And those colors, the ultramarine blue and transoxide red, are both transparent. So if you mix those together and then just applied it when you were oiling out, just within that shadow as a glaze, it would do essentially the same thing, because a glaze is always darken. So if we push that value down, you can see how it could help that green even transition and just widen maybe that dark midtone, push it over a little bit to the left, and you can see that's already starting to turn that form more gradually. You can also see it be a little darker in this eye socket, and that transition up into the forehead here, just pushing that edge or that darker value over a little bit further. It's a minor change, but it does make her feel like a darker skin tone than what you had before. The same would go down in here when we get down into the chin, just pushing that value down a little bit more. It's going to give you a little more dimension to that area, and I would say a little bit more on the side plane of the nose too. Because even though it's a very smooth transition, it's not technically a real strong shadow, she does have that darker tone right in there, and that helps to, again, rotate that form and accentuate the dark kind of value of her skin. Also, don't forget to keep these shadows a little bit warmer for that cast shadow. If it gets too cool, it's going to feel like you put some opaque color in there. The lip color looks pretty good. So let's talk about that highlight color. So here we have all this warm kind of yellow reflection. So if we go in and just look at the brightest highlight, which is in her forehead, and I would kind of start there, and you don't have to cover all of the yellow, but if in the center you put in just a little bit more of a cool pink, it's going to vibrate off that yellow. So kind of look at how that makes it feel almost more intense. You do have some nice cool pinks and violets in here. I think those are pretty good, but let's go ahead and take some of those highlights and just push them a little bit cooler. And one area you can go even more cool on the spectrum is right in that eye socket. See how gray it gets in there? That's going to add some interest. This is an area where you will commonly find a lot of cool tones because the skin gets very thin in here. So you can kind of push that. Even in her lids, she had a little bit more of kind of a purple gray hue, so you could push those a little bit more. And get a little more variety to that flesh tone. So you can see the difference there. And it's real subtle, but now she feels a little bit more appropriate to the photo that we have of her, if that makes sense. But those are pretty much my only suggestions. Of course, you would carry that same kind of adjustment down through the rest of the body, but I'm not going to worry about changing that. It's just know for like consistency, you would add those cooler kind of gray purples throughout the rest of the skin. Since you're not in here live, just let me know if you have any questions. Just follow up with me by email if you do. But otherwise, I look forward to seeing your painting next week. Really nice job. All right, Sapana, that is your turn. So let's go ahead and get started. But I did have a question for you because this one looks very, very red. So I want to make sure. I tried to adjust it a little bit, but let me know how it looks, your painting looks compared to the photo here in person. And I can make some adjustments. It seems a little bit red on my end, and I'm wondering if it needs to be a little more yellow or maybe a little bit more blue. Okay, I'll just keep an eye on the chat box there, but let's go ahead and get started if you don't have any suggestions for changes. I know there's a little delay between you guys hearing me and your response. All right, so yeah, beautiful job. I think the shadow value seems pretty good. I can't tell just because there's a little bit of glare, but it looks like maybe it could be a little more red, very subtly, but you're within the right value range, it seems. So if I just take 2 samples of that, yeah, you're right within the value range. It could just be the photograph kind of reflecting that. If you wanted to, you could go in and add a little bit more red to that shadow, but I think you're plenty dark enough. The area I would suggest going a little bit darker is that spot right adjacent to the shadow. Yours jumps a little bit too, the glare looks a little, makes it look a little red. Oh yeah, okay. Let me, before I get into that part, I'll try taking out some of the red. I know capturing the picture or the colors accurately can be quite a pain. We'll take out some of that. How does that look? It looks a little closer to me. All right, so let me take a new color sample there. So I think it's not that you don't have actually the right color right in here. This actually seems pretty good right over in here. That's very close to what you have right here. But I think right next to the shadow, let's push it a little bit darker. And what that's going to do is get this form to round a little bit more slowly. I can see that you probably had something in there, but maybe the tile got blended out or something. So we'll do that with the paint over. You do have those beautiful cool pink highlights, so I don't think that needs any adjusting. You have some really nice cool violets in here. I think that looks great. I'm just looking around a couple of other areas. I think her bottom lip, maybe if we went a little bit more of a vibrant pink, I'm going to change this background color because it's a little hard to see those lighter values. So if we look at the color up here, you're in the right color family, but maybe it's a little dark, so it's making the whole lip feel a little sunken back. Now, you do have the right values in this upper lip, because that upper lip is an underplane. You know, it's meaning it's turning under, even though her lips are very full and round. It's wrapping down, but the bottom lip should catch a little bit more light. And I think that would help to bring out the form. And maybe a few more dark steps down in this chin, like that average tone in the chin that you have there. And hers is a few value steps darker, very close to the color over here actually. Let me make some notes here before I get lost with all the different colors. So here we have, this was the shadow. So this was your color and this is her color. So what we want to do, you could just add, even just glazing with like a transparent red oxide or something similar. That should give you a little bit more warmth into that shadow. This was your color here. So this is the dark mid-tone next to the shadow. Oops, shadow edge. Sorry if my handwriting's hard for you guys to read. So for that one, I think it just needs to be a little bit on the darker side. I would throw in some burnt sienna. That would probably do it. And that alone would probably get you close to that. But if it gets too warm, you could always add a little ultramarine blue. And that would help to cool it off as well. This was the lip color. And we just want to brighten that up. That's a pretty easy fix. You would just add a little bit of white to the existing color, and I think it would give you something pretty close. And then this was the chin. So you're here, and we just need to go darker because that fall off of light that happens as the form kind of rolls down, it's not going to be nearly as intense. Some of the average tone, if we compared those two different values, they're going to be slightly different. So I'm going to do a quick paint over. Do you have any questions so far? So if I just went over and kind of glazed into your shadow with something a little bit warmer, and look at how far that kind of fades off and carries over into the forehead. It just adds some richness to, and I feel like you almost have that color down in here, but you could kind of liven that up and that would help a lot. And then adding, you could leave the pink that you have, which is like right in here, it's a perfect color, but make a darker version to put in here just to help transition out of that shadow. And you can see how just the addition of that helps to bring her skin tone kind of into a different realm. I think you would probably use something similar up here because her forehead does have a little bit more of a dark tone as it transitions over. I can't quite tell what colors are there just because of the glare. So just look at that area if you do want to go back into it. Let's see, on the side plane of the nose, I feel like you're pretty close. Yeah, you're in the right value range, it seems. The underplane of the nose could use a little bit more transition. So let's go ahead and jump into that really quickly. So if you look, she has a very warm shadow. So usually on the nose itself, you're going to have the shadow for the underplanes of the nose, which is usually kind of like this V shape, right? She even has a little shadow on that side there. It's not quite as big because it has a little more light kind of coming in, but that helps to turn it under. And you can see she has that same shadow kind of wrapping around and coming up into that side plane of the nose. Also, any shadow within the eye socket is going to be a little bit on the warmer side because there's going to be light hitting the eyelid. Let me get a pencil here to draw with. So you have light hitting here, and it's going to illuminate a little bit in there. And that's actually what's happening here. We have light coming in and reflecting into these planes from here to here. So that's usually why the nostril and the actual plane of the underplane of the nose is a value step lighter or so from the cast shadow. So then we go back in and we have the cast shadow from the nose, which helps us go in and define, let me grab a smaller brush here, helps us go in and define the wings of the nostril within that shadow mass. And of course, the opening of the nostrils. And then moving out from that, it's this very similar to the cheek. We want to make sure we have plenty of half tones kind of following that plane change. And if you look, there's usually kind of a connection between the ball of the nose. So there's actually like a spherical form. You have the ball of the nose, and then we have kind of these winged nostrils, right? They all kind of have a roundness to them, but where these forms interact, like here, you're going to have the sphere. So if you kind of keep that in mind, we're going to have, you can kind of see it on this picture here, these midtones that are going to start to sculpt some of that. So there sometimes is a little bit of a connection, midtone here. It doesn't mean you see it all the way around, but you will start to see a little bit of it. Sometimes in her case, there's a little bit of a break in that. She has a little bit of a break in that tone connecting. And also that wing of this nostril is not going to be as bright as what we have over here. So you just want to make sure you're keeping your values in check here. One way to do that is to kind of tone everything like that form and then go in with something just a little bit lighter. And in this case, maybe I'd grab something here in this range and then just add a little bit of a light on that form. And then you can, everybody's nose is kind of different. It's like lips. They have unique character to each shape. So it helps to, know the general planes, of course, but then you have to kind of look at this individual's particular shape that they have. But you see how that kind of helps to sculpt the form a little bit more. And then, of course, we have this side plane here, which I feel like you have pretty good. If I just kind of outlined where it is and it kind of scoops out into the light. I feel like you have that pretty good. Some people have, it depends like on a more like European nose, you'll sometimes have more of like a very strong bridge. It varies so much person to person, like I said, the individual shape. Her planes here are very slowly turning. So like if we looked, the form kind of comes like this. So it's a little bit more flat. On someone else, you might have something that's more rigid like this, and you'd see like a really sharp kind of defined like shape in here. So you just kind of look at how the form is rolling and define it as best as you can. I think one thing that happened is maybe your highlight got too spread out. So if we went in with another kind of pinkish mid-tone. Maybe I'll pull one color that you have here. Maybe a little bit darker. And kind of followed it in that shape and then had that highlight. Hers is even maybe a touch darker actually. And then you have that same thing happening on that side. It's just in a lighter kind of value, but you see that slight division here of that ball shape. Does that make sense? Did that help to see some of the planes? Also, and I actually we didn't have time in this class because this class focuses on the skin tones. We're really kind of diving into more of the color theory aspects, but in my other class, the one on, well, both the drawing class, but also in the color portrait class, it's like the 10-week one, I actually do spend time going into the planes of each of the features and how, you know, you go about painting each of those individual features. It's a little bit more in depth because, you know, it's more about portraiture all around. Whereas in this one, we're kind of just diving into color. So if you have any questions about that, let me know. Okay, so here I have, because that could be a topic all in itself, is studying the planes of the head. I also look at the planes of the head model that I had sent out earlier. That can be really, really helpful, especially as you approach this new painting. You'll see in the first lecture, if you haven't already watched it, that I have Kiara side by side with the Asaro head under like the same kind of lighting condition. And you can really see how those planes sculpt the form. It's just much softer on a female. And sometimes on men, you get more of that chiseled edge, which resembles the Asaro head a little bit closer. But you can still see it, and it's a really useful tool. And you can buy the Asaro head. It's ASARO. I'll try and find a link. They used to have it to where you had to call them to place an order. They might have it a little bit easier to order online now. But if you're wanting a tool to use in the studio that's really, really helpful, I've used it when I don't have a model available and I needed some clarification on like what the light was doing, or I needed a stand-in kind of mannequin. I've used the Asaro head for like inventing, heads until I could get a model in. So it's a really useful tool. I refer to it all the time. So if we go in and just lighten up this top plane of the lip there, you can see how that already got it to stand out a little bit more. And then of course her highlights, I would just redefine those right where that plane change is, but you can see how that really got the bottom lip to pop out. And then we would just take more of this deeper mid-tone to the chin and close in on that highlight. That highlight is quite small. And pull more of that dark mid-tone that you have over here down lower. I think your color here seems pretty good. My only suggestion would be that maybe you would take this color and pull it in a little bit wider right in here, especially down as we get down towards the lower part of the face, because that, if you think about that plane change in the head, this plane here is facing up towards the light. This plane is starting to rotate down. The forms are kind of rotating this direction. So they're going to move away from the light and pick up more of a dark mid-tone. So you'll notice like right along the edge of her skin, it actually even gets slightly darker. So if you were to go back in, I would even maybe take something between the background color and the color you have existing there a little bit, very naturally. And that's one trick I use often to get whenever you have a really light edge against a really dark background, mix something that will fit value-wise in between those two, or you can even take a darker mid-tone and just do a very thin tile right along that edge, and it just gets that form to turn ever so slightly towards that background, and without you having to actually blend the two edges together with a brush. All right, so yeah, really nice job. I do think your highlights are good. They're in that cool pink zone, so I don't think you need to adjust that any. Do you have any questions? All right, beautiful job. I look forward to seeing your painting next week. All right, Brenda. Before we get started, I just wanted to ask you if this looked a little bit on the red side. The background does, but the skin tones seem pretty close. But just let me know if you need me to make any adjustments before we jump in. Or if it needs to be darker or something like that. Okay, all right, so we'll just jump right in. All right, so I think you captured her average skin tone really well. My suggestion would be to maybe push that shadow value. Now, if this photo looks a little bit on the light side to you, maybe you won't need to do that. But her shadow value is a little bit, I think, darker. I think it's probably closer to what you have in your core shadow here. You're very, very close there, but I would say maybe the reflected light feels a little bit on the light side. You could always try glazing that down if you wanted to make corrections to that. I think that would also give a little bit more range for these dark midtones. And I found that this was a pretty common correction across a lot of different students. They have the average midtone right. The average skin tones overall look like the model, but that transition of those dark midtones could be pushed a little bit darker. And if you're used to painting more fair skin, it can be a little scary to push those other ones so dark, those midtones that are right adjacent to the shadow edge. And I think it's a common fear to go too dark in your painting anyway. This is something that I remember fighting myself on too, even when painting more of a fair skin model, is to push those midtones dark enough to get that form to really roll gradually across towards the light. So if I take a sample there, so that's kind of what hers is, and she does have kind of a greenish color in some areas too. Like here, I feel like it shifts a little bit greener, but I'm gonna make this background color a little bit darker. And then, but if I go in here, I feel like it is, even when I kind of hint towards your darker version, it's still a little bit on the lighter side. So you could definitely push that a little bit darker, and I think that's going to get that form to roll a little bit more. I think you have some really nice cool tones on that left side, which feel pretty accurate to what she has, but I think the value maybe down in here below the mouth. Needs to go darker and cooler, and that's going to sculpt that left side a little bit more as well. Her upper lip too could probably be a little bit on the darker side. I feel like you do have some areas of that color, but if you kind of take like the average for that left side, hers is just a little bit more of a deep kind of purple and a little bit cooler as well. Trying to be consistent with how I'm laying these out. Hold on, let me just catch up here. All right, let me label these out just so I don't lose track. So this is the shadow, and this is your reflected light. This is the mid right cheek, and we want to go a little bit darker this way. And this was under the lip. Under lip. And we want to go this direction here. So I think that would just be an addition of like ultramarine blue. And maybe a little bit more red if it goes too blue. Maybe a little bit of cad red or alizarin. For the cheek, it's really, really close. I think it just needs to go darker. So whatever you used for your mixtures there, just add more of that, the dark colors. So my guess would be maybe some more burnt sienna and ultramarine blue maybe. And then this was for the, this was for the top lip. So upper lip. We just want to go from here to here, so just a little bit more ultramarine blue, and that should give you that color. So go a little bit more on the purple side. Any questions so far? I'm going to go ahead and do your paint over. Okay, so let's just say we push that shadow down. So I'm going to show you what that would look like. Even just a glaze would actually do that pretty well. Mostly that reflected light area. There is a cast shadow from her eye pushing back, and this shadow kind of carries up the form and leads into the forehead. And I would probably darken this reflected light as well, just to make that shadow a little bit more uniform. She even has just a little deviation here where that shadow kind of comes up close to that lip. So you could even add that in, and then use the same color to go into the lip here and build more of a shadow plane. Into that lip shape. But you can see already how that's already pushing the value range, and it makes it easier for you to judge this color, which will be a little bit on the darker side. And once you start to introduce some of these darker colors, you can see how, you know, your other average skin tones are kind of locking into place appropriately. So like the color you have in here is going to work nicely for that cheek, and I don't think you really need to change that. She does have a little bit of this color also on this side plane of the muzzle, so that helps to sculpt that cheek separate from the muzzle form. And then if we look under, well, let me do the, since we're near the lips, that upper lip here, just pushing that a little bit darker. Starts to sculpt that form a little bit more. And then under the lip, this underplane, you have to think of like this form here as like a little sphere. So as it wraps down, it's going to pick up more of that dark kind of color. And I would go a little darker along that edge. Same idea to kind of wrap that form back. And I think here, you're really close. I would just maybe add a little bit of warmth, almost like a tiny bit of her average skin tone. Maybe something like that back in. I was telling the earlier group that I probably would revisit my painting as well and introduce a few areas of some warmth to kind of pop those cool highlights, because even though it goes really cool on that left side, quite suddenly I would probably introduce just a few areas of warm to kind of create some continuity between the two planes. And you would also notice that you could probably go a little bit lighter on this left side plane of the nose and look at where the light kind of trails up that form. And you could probably pop the highlight a little bit more in a few areas. Or sometimes it's just a matter of changing the color, like making it a little bit more bluish to get it to vibrate a little bit more than the yellow. You can still utilize some of that yellow, just have something a little bit cooler in the middle, and it's going to kind of play off of that, if that makes sense. So let's take a look here. So yeah, just adding those additional midtones really pushes it more into the dark. The darker range. Hi, Natalie. What do you mean that this is someone else's painting? Did I put the wrong one in here? I might have. I was doing this quite late last night. Brenda, this is your painting, right? I'm pretty sure. Let me just double check here. Oh, okay. All right. I have mixed them up before just because, you know, I'm downloading all of the images and stuff, so it can happen. You're next, Natalie. So, okay. I'm glad I didn't accidentally switch those around. So, Brenda, do you have any questions? All right. Well, beautiful work, and I look forward to seeing your painting next week. Good job. All right, Natalie, now you're up. Just before we get started, let me know if the picture of your painting looks a little bit on the light side. I just want to make sure before we jump in. That's always what it comes down to, Brenda. It's always about just more practice. And that's why I provided more than one photo reference so that you guys can, you know, revisit these videos. You guys will have lifetime access to the videos. So what happens at the end of the course is I will add a special link to where you can go to my Gumroad account and download or sign up to get the class for free, essentially. So it's like a private link that everyone in this class can use. And then you will have continued access to the class through our website, I think until December. It's 3 months from the date you purchased it. So, so just keep that in mind, guys, that you guys will always be able to access these videos and rewatch them and use the photo references and keep practicing. Okay, so it's a little bit light. Let me adjust that here. Bring the curves down just a little bit. That always oversaturate, so I'm going to just decrease the saturation just a touch. How does that look? Is that a little closer? All right, perfect. All right, so really nice work. Let's start by looking at the shadows. Now the photograph it looks like you have some sinking in happening. So like what's happening here is it looks gray. Same thing in the hair, and maybe even a little gray here. Whenever a painting sinks in, it always looks a little more dead in color. So if I'm telling you it needs to be warmer in the shadow and you want to adjust the painting, just remember to oil this area out first before you go back in, and it might bring that red back. So take a look at that and oil it out before you make any changes. So you can see that that one just has a little more red. I can sense almost the red, so it's probably just a matter of oiling out your painting. But just keep that in mind. I want everyone to keep that in mind as I'm going through your paintings. Colors do sink in, so if you do go back and make corrections, make sure you oil out your painting. Okay, so yeah, this looks really nice. I think a few areas I would suggest, I feel like you are plenty dark enough here. It's a little bit on the gray side. She has a little bit more warmth in those halftones. But you're in the right kind of value range. So you could even apply just a glaze to that area if you wanted to warm it up. And that would help to bring it a little closer. And then I think there's just a few areas where you could pop the color a little more chromatic, and that would help to add some variety to the flesh tones. And that one spot would probably be in the lips. So, oops. So here's the color we want, and then yours is probably just a little bit on the warm and bright side. So maybe bringing that value down, but also adding a little bit more of a cool berry color to it, like an alizarin would do that, would give you some of that, and that's going to give you a little more variety. And then if we look at the highlight color on her, it's a little bit more on the purple side, and yours is kind of remaining more in the yellow range. So, and even in the forehead on her, like at the brightest points, it's pretty close to the same color. You can see it's just a little bit brighter in the forehead. So let me mark these out really quickly, make some notes for you. Make that background a little bit darker. Okay, so here we have our shadow. So if you want to, I would just glaze with like a transparent red oxide, maybe a little bit of alizarin if you feel like it needs it. But oil it out first before you do something like that, just to see if that red comes back, because it looks like it could just be weak. And it just needs a little bit more red. So you could take that color and just add a little bit of cad red, and it would probably give you something close to what you need. And this is the bottom lip. Just add more alizarin. That should give you something pretty close. You can always look at your color chart to kind of refer to something and try and get something close to that. And then the highlights. This is the cheek. This is the forehead. So you want to kind of go this direction with this one. Just more pink. So maybe a little more of a cool pink. Alizarin and white. Same thing. Alizarin and white. I'll do a little paint over so you can see. And what that's going to do is you have all these beautiful warm tones in her skin. So by placing a cool tone kind of adjacent to it, it's going to help vibrate off of those warm tones and give kind of the illusion of a glow. So let's let's do that little paint over now. Do you have any questions so far? Okay, so if we warmed up that shadow, I just want to show you what that would look like. Create some nice kind of vibrancy. And it does pull up into her forehead just a little bit more and into that eye socket and the cast shadow from her eye. It might turn that color when you go in and oil it out, so if it is, then you can just leave that alone. And then the halftone in the cheek area. Down low, it gets kind of more greenish, I'd say. But maybe in the cheek, you could go a little bit more red. I think it needs to be a little darker as well. And maybe a little bit in that chin there. I do like the addition of that kind of greenish gray that you have, though. It's working well. So leave some of it if you are going to make some adjustments. And then I think in her forehead, she has a little bit more of a dark mid-tone that kind of carries a little closer to the left. Gives a little more contrast to that highlight. Let's see what happens if we add a little more chroma to that bottom lip. Grab that cool pink highlight color. Yeah, that can be a slight difference just in the photograph. So when you come back to your painting with the notes, just these are areas I want you just to look at, and if you find in person that you are seeing some of my suggestions already in there, then you don't need to really make the changes. Okay, so taking that brightest highlight color, that pink, if you just go in and right in the center where it's the most intense, you can even leave some of that yellow kind of halo around it. Just build up that pink a little bit brighter. In fact, the shape is a little bit smaller than that. Her highlight is quite concentrated. So something like that. You can see how it kind of vibrates off of that yellow and just feels a little bit brighter. That almost feels like that's a little dark. Maybe I'll try that one. And then the same thing in here. And you could even use it to kind of carry a little bit more of the highlight to the left, just a little bit. And soften out that highlight on the chin. She even has some of that over here. It's just in like a darker kind of cool pink. And you see how the pink helps to complement all that warm tone that you have, that yellow undertone that you have in her skin. Does that make sense? So I'll just show you a quick comparison. It's really about getting that shadow nice and warm, and also a little bit darker on those midtones as they push to the left, or sorry, to the right. So if you oil it out and you find that those shadows are already kind of warmer, then you don't need to make adjustments to them. And I would just go in with this mid-tone and push it a little bit warmer and a little darker. And that will help to kind of sculpt her, especially in that forehead. I think it could benefit from that a little bit more. But beautiful job. All right, Erin, are you in here? Thought I saw you here earlier. Same thing goes. Let me know if your painting feels a little like it needs a little color adjustment. I'm thinking it feels a little bit on the yellow side, but let me know if that's how your painting looks in person, and I can kind of tweak it. Before we jump in. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and jump and get started, but let me know if it does, and I'll keep an eye on the chat box. Oh, it looks mostly the same? Okay, we'll just go with it then. All right. Nice likeness in the model. Really good job there. I feel like her average tone looks pretty good. Maybe a little bit more like of a red reflected light in that shadow. It could just be, again, the painting kind of sinking in, but if you give it a little bit more of a rich tonality, that could help. You can see yours is just slightly more blue. She probably has a little bit more red in the forehead. I'm thinking compared to this color here, which is favoring yellow a little bit. This seems pretty good in pink, though it might be able to go a little bit darker. So let's look at that left cheek there. All right. And then the highlight color, I think your highlights looks cool enough. It's a little hard to tell if it's just the camera kind of washing out the color in your highlight. Maybe we would look at maybe pushing a little more pink in there. And then down in here, I think we might want to push that. Let me make this background color a little darker there. A little bit more towards kind of a purple. And maybe it could benefit from being a little bit darker. So it's a little bit more towards the red violet. So you have a question, is there a way to lighten a core shadow without losing the transparency? Yes, there is. So one thing I would do is start by building in more of a reflected light. That can help. But if you're talking about the core shadow like in here, you would just mix something to lay over it opaquely. And what I mean by that is it's like an actual mixed color, not just a transparent glaze. Glazes are always going to darken what you have underneath. So if you want to lighten a core shadow, you're going to have to go in with a somewhat opaque color. But what I mean by that is to use something, for example, you can make a color like mixing cad red, which is a more opaque red, into that shadow color, and it's going to lighten it, but you're not going to lose the sense of transparency. It doesn't mean it's going to be a transparent color, but it won't lose that sense of richness or the feeling of the shadows being more transparent, if that makes sense. I can do that like digitally and kind of show you how that would look. Let me just make a few notes here, and then I'll get started on that painting. Okay, so here we have our shadow. We want to go a little bit richer, so you could try mixing, like I said, taking your existing color and add a little bit of cad red. And that should give you something like that. And then this was, I believe, that color in the forehead, right? Is that this color here? Yes, it was. Okay, so just making sure I'm not mixing these up when I make the notes for you. So this is the forehead. And I would say like average skin tone. just a little bit more rosy. I think if you added just a tiny bit of like an alizarin, very, very small amount, it would kind of push it towards that. This was that far left cheek. So this was the left cheek. And we just need to go a little bit darker and again more rosy. So I think just an addition of some alizarin would get you there. And then I believe this was the chin color. This was the area, yeah, this was this area under here, under the lip. So so I'll just write under lip on the left. So we want to go just a little more violet. So we would want to add a little bit of alizarin and probably blue just to cool that off. And you have a lot of yellow tones in there. So you'll notice that what we're doing is introducing some of those cooler tones, and that's going to help to balance out her skin. So let me go ahead and start the painting. Do you have any questions so far? So I'm going to start with that shadow, and let's see what that would look like to really kind of warm that up. And you might find that your painting actually has this warmth in person. Maybe it's the camera's not picking it up. The cameras always tend to favor either shadow or they favor light, and they don't always pick up those nuances. So if you oil out your painting when you decide to go back into it, and that red kind of comes out when you oil it out, then you probably don't need to make too much of an adjustment unless you want to lighten it, like you said. And then I think the main thing is that this color carries up a little bit higher into the forehead. And then I think maybe going a little bit darker and a little bit warmer just through this cheek area where you have this transition right next to that shadow edge. So you can see how that's starting to round that off a little bit more. Then all your other colors lock right into place. So under the lip here, if we just kind of made that a little bit more of a purple, because it's going to be picking up that background color, and it even goes just a touch darker and more gray as it moves over to that shadow. And she has more of that color down in the lower chin because that fall off of light. So maybe making the chin a little bit darker. And it gradually fades towards your shadow. That forehead color, I think we had said we're going to just warm it up a little bit. So just in a few spots, mostly here and here. And then she does have some of these kind of cooler pink purples around the highlight that kind of make it a little bit lighter. That kind of get that cool highlight to glow. And I think the only other area was really that left cheek, kind of pushing this value over here a little bit more. So like right in this area. Just what it's going to do is introduce a little bit more of that average skin tone, a little darker, and it's going to give your highlights a little more contrast. Even up here near the eye, going a little bit darker there. And it really sculpts out that form. Does that make sense? those were pretty much my only suggestions. Of course, you would start to take some of that cool tone and introduce it down into the chest area once you get the face kind of where you want it. You might even consider warming up. I can't tell if it's just the color falling a little bit dead, but you might consider going in here and just really introducing adjacent to it so that that form kind of rounds out more softly. You're very welcome. Beautiful job though. Yeah, great work. All right. Natalia, now it is your turn. I don't know if you are able to attend live, but I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Let me know. Your picture looks a little bit on the light side, so I just wanted to ask if it was as light as it looks here before we jump in. Let me get here and get into the right layer. All right. So my guess would be it would be a little bit more down in this range in terms of value, but definitely not the saturation. Bring that back to where it was. Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So I think this color looks like it's sunk in, very much what's happening with everyone else's. That's fine. If you guys want to avoid that, just as a tip for the next week or so, if your painting is dry, you can actually oil out before you photograph, and that can help. You can also do like a very light spray of a retouching varnish. You don't want to do like a permanent varnish, but you could do a spray on retouch varnish, and that'll bring the color back to life. Just make sure you do that in a well ventilated area because it's very smelly stuff. But that can help to bring that back, and you can still paint back on top of it if you need to. It's not always the most recommended technique, but it can work. As far as you don't want to make that a habit every time you need to paint back into your painting. It's better to oil out. But if it's just to photograph for the critique, then you can do a very light spray and it'll bring back your colors, or you could just oil it out and then wipe off the excess when you're done. One thing I like to use when I'm oiling out is like a latex makeup sponge instead of a towel. I'll apply it with a brush, wipe off the excess with the sponge, and I do that because it doesn't leave any residue behind, or any lint or dust or anything like that. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in here. So I'm going to just compare the shadows, but again, little disclaimer, if it's sunk in and you oil this area out and it looks like all the color gets darker and back to the right value, then you don't need to worry about it. That looks pretty good. It could be a little bit darker and more red, but we'll do that in the paint over. And then I think you have kind of a greenish transition. It works pretty good, but I think maybe we'd want to go a little bit more red and dark right in here, because that jump, the green could probably even stand to go a little bit darker. That if we use that color as an example. And I think maybe utilizing some of her average flesh tone a little bit more in a couple of different areas. This one feels like a little hot. I'd say this is probably a little closer. To what she actually has elsewhere. So this was the cheek here. I'm just going to put that there for comparison. Let me make some notes here so I don't lose track. Okay, so here's the shadow. So we just want to add a little bit of a dark red. You can use alizarin or you can use red oxide or a combination of the two. So I would say alizarin and red oxide. And that's going to make it darker and richer. But I would oil out first to make sure that that's what needs to happen. And then the next tone is that transition, or the dark mid on the right cheek. And we want to go this direction. So because we're wanting something right adjacent to that shadow. So I think if you just start maybe with a fresh mixture, my guess would be that the mixture would be something around burnt sienna, yellow ochre, and maybe a small amount of white. That might give you something close to it. If it's too rich, it looks pretty good from the forehead. But the cheek needs to be a little bit more like this one. And then I think if we went a little bit darker with that color on the left side, so let's take that and just compare it here. You're just a little bit on the light side, and that's going to bring it a little bit more balanced. So let me make a note of that really quickly. So we want to go a little bit, this is the left cheek, and we want to go darker. So you want to go in with more alizarin and maybe a little more, well actually even if you just took your average, I think if you took your average flesh tone instead and just added a little bit more blue, you could get there. If not, you can just do this one and ultramarine blue to get there, but that might fight you a little bit to go from such a light color. So I'm going to use some of these to do a quick paint over here. Okay, so I'm going to start off by warming up that shadow. But again, if your color comes back then and it doesn't feel like it needs it, then all you have to do is just oil that out. You can see how that richness really helps. I can definitely tell it's sunk in here because it's you probably had it really close to like a black. I do think this color can carry up into the forehead just a little bit further over and in that eye socket where it turns under right here in her cast shadow. So getting that nice and rich, then you can see how this halftone could be a little bit on the darker side to create a nice kind of smooth transition to that shadow edge. I think you have a nice color down in the muzzle area where it goes a little more green, but then maybe you could introduce a little bit more of that color in the lower chin. However, up here, maybe we could take this color and go just a little lighter and a little pinker with it. So it doesn't quite hit that highlight so hard, so maybe go in with a little bit of pink before you go back in and edit that highlight color. That cheek, if we just go in to where it's really chromatic and just make it a little bit cooler and use something very similar on this far side, especially where that form starts to turn down and we get a little bit more color. You can see it in here. It helps to break up that kind of solid highlight. You could even go in with a slightly darker kind of purple to break up that highlight there. And her highlights do have a little bit more of a cool pink to them. Yours is coming across as a little more on the yellow side, so same suggestion, you could just go in and kind of touch up some of those and make them a little bit cooler. And I would soften that light that you have up here. She does have a little bit of that highlight there, but it's not going to be as bright as the light you have coming down the center of the forehead. So you might consider making some adjustment to that one as well. And then take a little bit of this average tone here, maybe bring it in, introduce a little bit more of it into the forehead to kind of break up some of that intensity to the contrast. And I think that's about it. Maybe a little bit cooler pink in the lips, in the cheek. Then you'll definitely want to warm up some of the shadow in the nose and the inner eye socket as well. And the same thing in here. It always helps to make sure like the features have a lot of that warmth. Whenever you go really, really dark, you want to make sure it's also very, very warm. As warm as you can get it at that value, because it's going to add some life to the other skin tones. All right, well, really nice job. If you have any follow-up questions, since you're not in here right now, just send them by email. And before I actually address your fair skin tone, because you jumped into the critiques a little bit later, I'm going to open up to everyone here watching live. Let's just go ahead and do, if you guys have any questions, like we'll do our open Q&A now, and then I'm going to come back and give her critique on the fair skin tones. So you guys are welcome to go if you need to. Does anyone have any questions about what's coming up this week, or the previous week's lesson, or anything at all? You should have gotten 2 emails earlier. I'm providing, I did a post on the color gels, like the resource that I use to buy my color gels when I'm lighting my models. So I linked those, both one link for the UK and one from, both are Amazon links. So Amazon UK and then Amazon USA. So you guys can find those. And I also did a post because another student had asked me exactly what brands I'm using for each color, and I did a post on that. So you guys should have 2 emails on those things as well. Does anyone have any questions? Next week, I'm going to actually, I don't remember if I mentioned this morning. No, we are, Brenda. Okay, so let me clarify. Next week, we are having a critique, but it's not, you don't have to have your painting finished. So we're doing the same painting for the next 2 weeks. So I want you to have maybe some of the face or most of the face painted, but don't worry about, you know, the chest or anything else. Just kind of concentrate on the face for your first color pass. and then you can finish it out kind of in the following week. I do want to give everyone a critique next week because I want to give you some pointers so that you can go in and make corrections for the final critique, which will be the week after that. There was something else I wanted to mention. And I'm drawing a blank right now. So if you guys want to do your own painting, like of your own photo reference, send me the reference by Monday, just so I can take a quick look at it. Just send it by email. And that's pretty much it. I think there was something else I was going to say, but I'll probably think of it later. And if I do, I'll make a post in the forum about it. All right, guys. Well, feel free to take off. I'm going to actually give Natalia a critique on her fair flesh tone because she jumped in 2 weeks into our critiques, and so I'm kind of getting her caught up. So you guys are welcome to take off or stick around. That's up to you. And I think what I was going to mention was that I put in next week I'm going to actually do a bonus video on how to use the color gels. That's what I was going to mention. So next week during the lesson, since we won't have like some of the bonus lectures on like painting, each week we've had kind of like a bonus lecture. So next week what I'm going to do is actually talk about how to photograph your model, and I'm going to use my Asaro head to show you how to use color gels. So if you guys want to like attempt to play with the color gel lighting on your own, I posted those links so that you could buy the color gels and have them by next weekend if you want to try it out and just have fun with it. It's a lot of fun to play with them, and they're great for kind of teaching yourself and continuing like a practice in your studio. You can light a still life with them. They're like a clear plastic film that's colored, and so it colors whatever light you put it in front of. Just a little bit of a warning though, you don't want to put them in front of a really warm light bulb. So use like a CFL, something that doesn't get hot to the touch, or an LED light bulb if you're going to use those color gels and kind of clip it in front of it. All right, so I think that's what I was going to say. I think that's everything. All right, guys, feel free to take off, and if not, just stick around, and I'm going to critique Natalia's fair flesh tones. And thank you everyone for tuning in. And I hope you have a good week and enjoy your new lesson. It's going to be a fun challenge. All right. So Natalia, I'm thinking that I need to bring the value of your painting down just a little bit. The color looks pretty accurate, but I think the photo it's a little bit blown out. So I'm going to just bring that down a touch. And that looks pretty good to me. So we're going to do a little bit of comparison here. All right, so let's start with those shadows. I think your shadows might have gotten a little bit on the opaque and light side. So, and that means just that there's a little bit of white mixed in. So if I take a look here at even your darkest shadow, and then we compare it to this one here, you can see this one's a little bit more chromatic and a little darker. And then the same thing with the reflected light color here and here. And I can see almost like you had it there, but maybe you lightened it, or maybe your halftone got kind of mixed in. So that's what I'm kind of seeing here. It's a little bit more gray. So what I would suggest is going in to get these more chromatic colors. You're going to want to add probably Cad Red to this one. Or maybe start with a fresh color. So if there was any white in this mixture, then you want to kind of get rid of that mixture and just start with a fresh mixture. And for that one, I would just do cad red, a little bit of yellow ochre, plus ultramarine blue, a little bit of ultramarine blue. And then this would be the same mixture, but probably more ultramarine blue and more cad red, less of the yellow ochre. Looking at her average flesh tone, you're probably a little bit more on the yellow side, but it kind of depends on where I'm looking, because I do see that you have these kind of more pinkish areas, which is closer. So it might be a matter of taking one of those other colors and using it instead. I'm going to move that down a little bit. And then that cheek color, that seems pretty close to what you have. Yours might be a little bit more on the yellow side, ever so slightly, but you're in the right value range. So you could, you know, it could be the photograph kind of creating that illusion. You could probably just leave it, but maybe make her average skin tone a little bit on the cooler side. And up here in the forehead, it looks a little blown out. Compared to what you have. So let me make some notes here. So this is your cheek on the right. That seems pretty good. So it just needs probably a little bit more alizarin, and you would have that color there pretty good. Same thing with your average flesh tone. If you just added a little bit of kind of a cool pink, you could try alizarin, but you might also try cad red, because that's going to give you a little bit more of a rosy color. And then this is the forehead highlight, or well, actually it's more of the average. Your highlight color seems plenty bright enough. You just need to add some of that same concept. It's just a little bit lighter. So adding a little bit more alizarin, adding a little bit more of that cooler pink. The hair color seems pretty good, and everywhere else seems pretty good. I think you might have gotten a little saturated in this green here. That can work if you kind of balance it out. So let me start by kind of painting in, doing a paint over of the shadows, because as soon as we get those shadows a little bit deeper, it starts to shift how we see those midtones. And oftentimes the hardest colors to judge are those kind of in-between values and colors. So we want to go a little bit darker. Initially with that, especially that core shadow, you can see it gets really even darker down towards the edge of the chin. And then we get our reflected light, which gets more orange. It's almost a direct reflection of her hair color, and we get more of that down in here. Although it does go a little bit more gray, like what you have, it's a little bit on the redder side, and then it does get a little darker as it moves away. You might find yourself wanting to introduce a little bit of a reddish color as this sinks back into the hair. That way it doesn't get too green, because it will have a tendency to want to go green. So you can see how that has already kind of richened some of the color. And then moving into that cheek transition, you might find yourself wanting an even slightly darker color than the one we have there to carry up that edge. and back in this corner here where the hollow of the cheek starts to kind of carve out. And then her average flesh tone right in here, a little bit more pink, maybe a little less yellow. And you'll find that kind of spotted throughout, especially in those cheeks. You see it a lot, but even her overall skin tone has a little bit more of this cool pink cast to it. So just introducing a few more areas, and don't be afraid to go in again with that nice warm touch here on that side plane of the head. Her chin is another area that has a little bit more of that cool pink transition, especially where the ball of the chin starts to round down. And then that average flesh tone, a little more pink. We always get these cool grays right in here, but then that ball of the chin picks up a little more pink again. And then I think in the nose, you're probably going to want to warm up this color here, especially that reflected shadow. And it gets a little bit darker underneath, but it's still a very warm color. And that's going to add more life because she is so pale that it's very easy to kind of lose the richness in there. And I would even maybe beef that up a little bit in there too, just to add a little more liveliness to the color. The side plane of her nose could use a little bit more like of a pink as well to help transition that area, and maybe even introduce some darker values to sculpt the form. There's always a little bit of a slight darkening of the keystone shape right in here where it transitions into the bridge of the nose, so pay attention to where that happens as well. And I think the underplanes of her eye socket could be a little bit more of a dark value. I think you're right with the color being a little bit on the cooler side, but maybe go a little bit more towards violet and a little bit darker than what you had. So let's take a look at how that changed. So you can see how the shadow makes the biggest effect, the biggest change. So I would concentrate on really livening that up again, and then just introducing a few spots of pink into the different areas, and I think your painting will lock right into place. A really nice job. If you have any follow-up questions, just reach out to me by email. All right, everyone. Thank you for a few of you have kind of stayed. Does anyone have any last-minute questions? If not, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next weekend. Have a great week. Bye, guys.